Now moving on into our discussion, African youth need to break the borders in order to work together to address challenges facing the continent. Hundreds of youth leaders from across the continent gathered for the African Youth Summit today at UNISA in Pretoria. This year's event is inspired by Nelson Mandela's legacy of reconciliation, social cohesion, unity and freedom for all. Afro Worldview reporter Zugiswa Makoso filed this report.
South African prolific figure in entertainment, Puleng Malebati, condemned the othering of marginalized people in the entertainment industry. She was speaking at the Breaking Down Borders Africa Youth Summit at the University of South Africa. The summit encouraged young people to start taking steps in creating Africa they imagine for themselves.
Labeling for me becomes problematic because when you're not in the mainstream art, if you're doing a theater play, you are in the theater of the marginalized. When you are doing a radio show, it's a theater, it's a radio show which is a public service announcement. Or if you're doing something different, it's avant-garde. So you always just put in a box because you really can't fit into mainstream. But then again, why is it that mainstream has to have its own authority? Then everything else outside of it will just always have a little box over there, which means you can't enter into it.
The former Member of Parliament, Magdalene Munsami, believes that the South African policies on social economic issues are failing young people.
Now, what happens when a policy driver is underfunded or not funded? But you have, on the other hand, an institution which is overfunded, and at the same time, it does not deliver on the potential, the talent, the dreams, the ambitions of young people.
A Zambian 25-year-old activist says that young people should start participating actively in politics to help shape a better Africa.
I was talking to some young people there. You are in politics. Me, I can't. But then who's going to talk about the youth policies? The Midalas who are 90 years, do you think they care about young people? And if young women cannot enter politics, do you think the men care about menstrual hygiene? Do you think they care about labor or female genital mutilation? They don't care. That's why we need to enter those areas we are scared to enter as young people for us to voice out.
Only 32 of 54 African countries have a youth policy. This proves that the continent lacks youth voices in policy-making positions. Zugiswa Makoso for Afro Worldview in Pretoria.
And now joining me in studio is Bakang Palai, the founder and managing director of Leroux Property Group. We also have in studio Mwendi Frequency, Katwiwa activist and writer. A very warm welcome to you and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
I'm going to start with Bakang. As a youth leader, here you're a managing director. When we talk about changing Africa, what comes to mind to make sure that when we talk about change, we put action into our words?
I think, as already mentioned, being a leader is not a word. In my own personal opinion, it's about the ability to be actionable and your action to be able to transcend in terms of how you foresee the world and the change you want to make. I think for me, it has always been that, in simple terms, be the change you want to see in the world, and that's how it is. My journey and my life, in terms of what I'm involved in, has always been about the ability to be the change agent, as well as to be credible in whatever that I do.
Mwenda, you currently work as a community organizer at the reproductive justice group, Women with a Vision. Now, are the youth leaders being given enough space to be able to lead without a hand from veterans, from men as well, when we look at women as well, when it comes to youth? Because in most cases, it seems as if when the youth needs to lead, they're actually told, no, stop, wait a bit, let's do it like this.
Yes, I think many places across this world, when they talk about youth engagement, they're really more talking about tokenization, right? So just bringing a young person and saying, oh, look, here's a young person, here's a script that they're reading, and that means we've engaged young people. But for me, in the work that I do with youth across, both in Nairobi and then also in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the US, it's always important to have a direct line of mentorship, because I don't believe that you can just turn things over to somebody one day. You just wake up, you decide, me, I'm old, I'm tired, I'm done. I believe it has to be an ongoing process, a relationship that you're building with people. And also, you're talking about young women specifically. I think that it's very important for elder women to be able to step in as interventions for young women who think that they're facing things that are, unheard of and no one else is going through, when in fact, so many experiences of marginalized people are actually shared across different lives, and we just don't voice them enough to talk about it. So.
And now, among the topics discussed was the elimination of social and cultural harmful practices. But we know that it is the 21st century and things have changed. Have you identified how this can be tackled without losing the transfer of culture to the next generation?
Yes. So I think when we talk about culture, specifically African culture too, not other cultures in the world, we have a very static viewpoint of it, right? It's as if you're only authentic if you're caught in this space of time, which is usually like the early 1900s, right? But even before the era of colonization, even before we started studying African culture was constantly evolving. African culture has not been the same from century to century, from decade to decade, and I think it's unrealistic to hold it to that standards or to those expectations, because it leaves those of us who are naturally part of this change feeling like we are doing something that is destructive to our culture and our traditions, when in fact we are continuing them on by doing the work of refining what is it that works for our generation and what is it that needs to be left in previous generations.
Now, Bakang, the summit is taking place over 5 days. You are a leader. As a leader, what do you want to hear being discussed in 2018?
The discussions and the observations over the past couple of days obviously has been about Africans telling their own story, and in terms of being able to reposition Africa as from a business point of view, as an investment hub, as well as not forgetting the challenges that we're currently trying to solve in our different countries. And I think Monday touched on a very also important element, because remember, from different countries, I mean, I'm from Botswana and she's from Kenya. What has been quite critical and has been the ability for us as well to appreciate our different cultures, which is what we need. We need to be able, before we can even integrate and work together, to be able to understand our different cultures in our different countries. But what has been coming up and in the conversations and the discussion has been that you realize that some of the challenges we're facing in our different countries are similar. It's just that the dynamics at hand are, they're different level. And really that's what the conference enables to do now. It puts us in a much more better position to be able to work with each other much more better, because without understanding of each other, which is always the key, it's very difficult to be able to undertake that. And remember as well, the platform has given us an opportunity to be able to network. And I mentioned the word credibility, to network with credible young people that are doing real work on the ground and that the foot soldiers.
But how is this possible when it comes to networking across the continent?
Quite interestingly, the founder for the summit, I met him 3 years ago through a program called Mandela Washington Fellowship in the US. He was representing South Africa, I was representing Botswana, and we managed to link up then, and the network has been built from that. So you can see how with the relevant initiatives and platforms being put into place to bring different African youth, you're able to interact and share ideas. So that's how it's been able to be. And I think another point which should be mentioned is when we talk about breaking the borders, we're not particularly speaking about the physical element, because there's no physical element. It's more of a mindset in terms of how do we make sure that we're able to work with each other without having in our mind what looks like was separated, but we're all one economy, and we can all through whether it's business be able to also sell our services or our products in different countries. And that's what the summit has been able to bring. It has been able to bring people in the fashion industry. It has been able to bring the creative. It is able to bring entrepreneurs in different spaces, as well as artists in different spaces.
I think the importance too is it's not just that it's bringing us together for basic networking. It's bringing us together to engage in critical conversations about what the history of this continent has been, where we currently are, and who and what gets to determine what the future of this continent is. I also really appreciate how the word border is very expansively defined within this summit. So on one hand, we are talking about the physical geographic borders that have been enforced onto our land without our consent, right? Which makes us challenge from the beginning, what does it even mean for me to identify as a Kenyan? And what does it mean for you to identify as someone from Botswana when those are colonial heritages? And no matter how you tear it apart, there was no Kenya before we were colonized, you know? There were Kikuyu. There were Kambas, which is where my people come from. But when we talk about identification, the first thing I go to is Kenya. And that's something that we don't think about. But when we're here in these spaces, I found myself being like, oh, what am I doing? What is Kenya actually? What does it actually mean to be Kenyan? What does that history come from? And what does that mean for the future that we are trying to create? We also talk a lot about the decolonization as a process instead of an act. I think for those of us who, especially our parents, were the generation that saw independence that came from our respective countries. We received independence, you know, and in some ways we were taught that independence and decolonization were the same thing, when in fact they were not the same thing. Decolonization will probably take as long, if not longer, than colonization itself to be undone, because of how deeply entrenched it's been in the new systems that we've done even after independence has happened. And so being able to have those tough conversations with one another and say, hey, I'm still colonized, you're still colonized, but that doesn't mean we are not decolonizing ourselves actively. And then really interrogating for ourselves on an everyday basis, not just on these big, when we come together on this summit, but how is it every single day that you're making sure you are living a decolonized life, and also living by the philosophy of each one, teach one. So not every African has the opportunity to attend summits like this, to hear about the history of the continent, to hear about Pan-Africanism, to hear about Africology. So what is our responsibility now that we've left this space to make sure that the information spreads? And when we come back next year, there's way more people here, people who may not have ever known, but are there because we brought them with our intention.
But now when we talk about building our legacy as the youth, do we have some kind of idea of the legacy? What should it be?
Well, with the panel the last panel that we had today was actually made me feel so hopeful. It was a panel of the whole conference is youth-centered, but this one was young people aged 16 to 23, I believe. Me, I'm 26 years old, so I'm slightly removed from them. But these young people were sitting there and articulating ideas, concepts, ways of living that I know that when they get to a place of actually making policy or making change, it'll be a completely different consideration than where my generation is, for instance. So when I think about what they were speaking about, a lot of them are talking about environment, right? The fact that we see natural disasters that we know are unnatural because of the ways that we inhabit this planet. And they're strategizing and thinking, how do we take our indigenous knowledges, our indigenous cultural practices, and incorporate them into technologies and sciences to make sure that our solutions are actually applicable here on this continent and in our spaces, and they make sense to our people as well. You know, back to what you're saying about tradition, making sure that as we're moving forward, we're also taking as much as we need from our past to make sure we are moving forward as ourselves and not just moving forward blindly into some future that we're being told this is development and this is progress.
Bakang, the summit, we understand that it will be addressing challenges facing the continent and plan effective solutions. It seems as if the previous years, the roadmaps that were put together and those solutions were never effectively used. What could have been the reason for this?
Well, it's only been 1 year.
It's only been 1 year for this.
Last year was the first year. And so he was telling a bit about the story of Paul, how they met. We actually met in New Orleans as well, me and Paul. And from that program is where I think he started to get this idea of, okay, you have the United States bringing all of these African youth together, but the ways they were brought together, there was some tensions and some issues, right? So he himself started to think, we need to be the ones organizing ourselves. So he did a tour of 12 or 13 different African countries. So we met with him in Kenya, he went to different places, and he connected with us and said, we want to know what's going on in your country, what's going on in your country, how do we bring all of us together? Fundraise to bring us all together. And then we sat last year. It was very intense, because nobody really knew what to expect. There was a lot that was put out there, and some of the changes that were implemented can be seen in this year's programming. So I think for me, I see a lot more focus on activism and resistance and what that practically takes. A lot more conversations on like capitalism and not just like business and entrepreneurship, but really taking a critical eye at the ways that we are engaging with the world around us.
But now I understand that this year's event has been inspired by Nelson Mandela's legacy of reconciliation, social cohesion, unity, and freedom for all. Is this theme not being abused in a sense that the country doesn't, the continent rather, doesn't seem to move away from discrimination? We've also seen in South Africa where we saw xenophobia taking place, and we also know that racial issues are still a problem in South Africa.
It goes back to the very first point of that we need to be able to understand each other and understand each other's background, because without that understanding, there's always going to be miscommunication and challenges. It further goes back in terms of the roadmaps, or perhaps what has been discussed over time in terms of how do we give solutions to the challenges we have in Africa. And fundamentally, based on the fact that we're also from different countries, and similarly so, it's there has to be policies as well in different countries that accommodate positive changes in terms of accommodating the youth. Because remember, the youth is the majority of the population in Africa, and the future is being created for this generation. So what has come out of it is in our different spaces, we need to relook at policies. We need to look at in terms of how do we create environments that not only can help the youth in terms of operating their business or any other changes they want to address in the current situation, but how do we make sure that that message collectively it's been understood by the different countries, and the vision has been built from that element. And my view is, of course, we have different bodies that tries to correlate a message and address one message in regards to that. And I think this initiative, as it is to try and start those debates, is to start those conversations, and to make sure that we keep the fire on. But the most critical point is we need to be actionable. I believe in a saying that says fail forward. So we need to be able, because we're getting into new territory, we're getting into new ways of how we believe that we should be able to tell our own stories, new ways in terms of how we want to have our own economic freedom, and to be able to address issues that are of big magnitudes in Africa, such as poverty. Now, and the only way we can do that is to be fearless in terms of us trying, as long as we keep the critical values, as long as we have the principles, and the principles, as you mentioned, in terms of the legacy by the late Nelson Mandela of Ubuntu, that we're all people, and we must all be able to accommodate each other. We must all be able to understand each other for us to be able to move
Unfortunately,
forward.
Bakang, I have to cut our conversation very short, but thank you so much for joining me in studio. That was Bakang Palai, the founder and managing director of Lero Property Group. We also had Mwendi Frequency, Katiwa activist and writer. Right now, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more news and updates. Stay tuned.